we're no longer in the age of Obama. The age of Obama is over. And so what does it mean when the numbers in our inner cities are worse than anything Moynihan could have conceived of? And what does agency mean for the poorest of the poor in the inner cities when the liberals, the left, and the right no longer are there to be their voices?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nell Pepper, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I am very pleased to introduce today's conversation with Daniel Geary, Benjamin Hedin, and Reverend Eugene F. Rivers, discussing the books Beyond Civil Rights, The Moynihan Report and Its Legacy, and In Search of the Movement, The Struggle for Civil Rights Then and Now.
I'd like to thank everyone at the bookstore for having us, and also Dan and Gene. It's a real pleasure and an honor to be here with them on this afternoon. I want to start off with just a quick word about In Search of the Movement and the work I've been doing the past few years. A long time ago, well, sort of, almost a decade ago, I was going to write this book about the summer of 1964 and folk music, and it's not really important, but the beginning of that book was about the search for these two forgotten blues singers in Mississippi during the summer of 1964, during the Mississippi Summer Project, or Freedom Summer, as it's more commonly known. And that eventually that book project became the documentary that she referenced in her introduction, and as I was working on the film, I met with and interviewed former directors of Freedom Summer, which was an important and climactic campaign that brought, as some of you no doubt know, almost 1,000 college students to Mississippi for 3 months in 1964. And when I was talking to one of the old directors, David Dennis, a man who had been with the Congress of Racial Equality in the 60s, he was still organizing. He was using many of the same lessons and techniques that they used to win the vote in Mississippi in the Deep South in the 60s, and he had applied them to school reform. We met in just a really hard-up school in Petersburg, Virginia. And in those conversations, in those days we spent together, I was given the image of something timeless. And the seed of the idea of the civil rights movement as a continuum, as an ongoing tradition of activism, rather than an isolated historical phenomenon, sort of stuck with me. I think that I knew that even then, this was in 2008, this was before Trayvon, it was before Black Lives Matter, it was before the court had ruled on Shelby versus Holder and taken down the coverage formula of the Voting Rights Clause. Even then I knew, the problems hadn't really gone away, and that 5 minutes in this school showed you that it was very much separate and unequal. So I knew the problems were still around, but what really intrigued me was this idea of a set of techniques, of the basic principles of work that you can take to sort of any context, be it the vote, be it community education. And so, that's eventually how I ended up writing In Search of the Movement, which tries to, show, as I said, the civil rights movement is something that is constantly present in American life, which is a conceit that has a lot of traction in academic quarters. I think most of the professoriate believes it, but I didn't want to, wait for history. I kind of wanted to take that on journalistically and get out ahead of it and say, this is what it is now. So the book is a series of profiles with activists like David Dennis, or if you're local and you know who Robert Moses is, people who did work then, still today, younger activists like the Dream Defenders. And then alongside that, because secondary to that purpose is, if you're going to see it as something that runs the gamut, then you do have to liberate yourself from the mythology or the folklore of the movement, that it's just this decade-long eruption of mass protest between 55 and the beginning of the Montgomery bus boycott and 65 when they march back into Montgomery with the Voting Rights Act having been won. It's a very powerful folktale. It's the perfect story in a lot of ways, but it kind of works to obfuscate or obstruct our knowledge of the freedom struggle as much as it, informs or teaches. So the book also talks about how the movement is remembered and what that remembering says about us as a nation.
So my book, Beyond Civil Rights, is about a document called the Moynihan Report. This is a document, 1965 document, so we're on the 50th anniversary, written by Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who was then in the Johnson administration. It was officially called The Negro Family, the Case for National Action, and it argued that what Moynihan perceived as the weakness in African-American family structure reflected in high rates of out-of-wedlock births, high rates of marital breakup. This would be the thing that would prevent African Americans from truly achieving racial equality. He was writing at a sort of a key moment. The Civil Rights Act had been passed, but Moynihan said that he recognized, in fact, that the demands of the Civil Rights Movement went beyond legal and political rights, but were demands, in fact, for economic equality. And Moynihan said that this economic equality would not be achieved because of the weaknesses he perceived in African American families. This was, for a time, captured the imagination of the Johnson administration, but quickly, when it became public, just a week after the Watts riots in August 1965, quickly became very controversial from any number of angles. And the report has been used in different ways, both by liberals arguing that the federal government needs to step in and do far more than it's done, but also by conservatives who say, aha, well, if family is the problem, then this is an issue of moral values that African Americans themselves need to address, and there's nothing effectively that the government can do. And this is what interested me. How can a document be used in these different ways? And I use this book really to explore debates over racial inequality and also class inequality in the United States over the past 50 years. In this report, I mean, I thought, if you're writing a book of history, all this seemed in the past, but the report just will not die. It keeps being used. Earlier this month, the police commissioner of New York City, he read the Moynihan Report over the weekend. Then he went on the Morning Joe and said that this report explained everything. This explained crime in New York City, family problems. Then the mayor was asked about it, and maybe he'd read my book, because he said, look, this report was written 50 years ago. It's a historical document. It doesn't really explain today's problems. And the police commissioner had to sort of retract some of the things that he'd said initially. More recently, actually, very inventive use of the Moynihan Report has been made by Ta-Nehisi Coates in his cover story in The Atlantic on the black family in the age of mass incarceration, in which he uses the Moynihan Report to sort of frame a discussion about the devastating effects of mass incarceration on African Americans in particular. And for those who are interested in the Moynihan Report itself, I did an annotated version of the report that's online with The Atlantic to sort of go along and complement Coates' piece. So I think that's all I'll say now about the book, but I'm looking forward to our discussion. I think our books have some similar themes in common for sure.
First, I want to compliment you both on writing very important intellectual and political interventions. The Moynihan Reports, in your case, this is an excellent essay, especially in reviewing the literature and sort of the historiography around the Moynihan Report. One of the things that I'd like to get into in both cases is how the historiography of the movement, and in this case the Moynihan Report, functioned to provide a conceptual lens for what we now understand black politics to be, and the issue of the family. Now, let me, in the interest of full disclosure, take just a couple of seconds to sort of talk about my own kind of political and intellectual development and evolution, because it overlaps some of the topics. I'm here with Jacqueline Rivers. We were students here at Harvard in the early 80s and became mentees of Bob Moses. Bob had come back from Tanzania and returned to finish his very complicated dissertation on Willard Quine. and was just settling in. And I learned from a friend in the college that Bob Moses had returned to the United States. He was living in Cambridge. And I and a student group actually pursued Bob with the explicit objective of getting to the, as much as we could, his analysis on what happens from 66, 67, when he leaves the United States, up until the present. He had been out of the country, as some of you know who know his story. He leaves the U.S., goes to Canada, then to Tanzania, spends time, raises a family, returns to the United States. And so for myself, Bob Moses was a major figure, and what we were particularly interested in engaging is, and I can frame the question this way: what does it mean for Bob Moses and SNCC to meet the wire? If, given the black movement and where it was, what is the significance of the SNCC legacy in Mississippi, in Harlem, Chirac, North Philadelphia? And in fact, we were part of a student group that left Harvard, went into Dorchester to begin working with drug gangs. This is 1988, 89, 90, at the height of the crack epidemic. And what we did is we used the neighborhood as a field study and an intellectual experiment to test the theories of social movements and the SNCC model, the King model, the Nation of Islam. What could we learn from the various movements to engage a challenge which was fairly unique? So on the one hand, we were in a dialogue, and in fact invited Bob to meet with some drug dealers. About 1989, there was an amazing exchange between Robert Moses and Dorchester's version of Omar. Now, it's literally true. There was a guy named Selvin Brown who was a major muscle in this town. And Selvin Brown and Bob Moses had an amazing exchange. And what was significant is that in the dialogue, as Bob was in the conversation with this young man in his face, right, they represented two different worlds that really didn't engage. What was also significant, and I'll wrap up here, is that we used what we saw on the ground, the amazing familial instability, the stuff that Moynihan had talked about in 65, right? And the irony for us is while Moynihan didn't get everything right, he got more right than the left would concede and that the right would understand. So it was infinitely more complex. And so maybe today we can engage in some of that. What does it mean? We're no longer in the age of Obama. The age of Obama is over. And so what does it mean when the numbers in our inner cities are worse than anything Moynihan could have conceived of? And what does agency mean for the poorest of the poor in the inner cities when the liberals, the left, and the right no longer are there to be their voices? Stop there. Because this is connected inextricably to both of your books. How is this related? How does that speak to Omar and Marlowe and their progeny? Now, before we go to Q&A, we'd like to get a dialogue here, then we'll open it up for everybody.
You know, I'll just say really, really quickly that, to answer his question of what does it mean when the wire meets SNCC, I think we're going to find out literally, because the people who wrote and produced The Wire are coming up with a mini-series on HBO based on Taylor Branch's trilogy. So
Right.
We'll actually see. But no, I think that if you're an activist from SNCC, you can sort of learn everything. SNCC itself didn't necessarily invent anything. They had a godmother, Ella Baker, who was instrumental in the activism and organizing in Harlem in the 1930s. But when you phrase it at the end, after Obama, when the left has forsaken you, I think that even though it sounds harsh, one of the central lessons of the history is the political process can only extenuate the morality and the urgency of the demand. You know, if you waited around for the Voting Rights Act, you'd still be waiting. I mean, you had to go into Selma. The movement, that's what makes that moment so miraculous, is that, LBJ was probably not ready. There's no way to know. But, and the movement, SNCC and SLIC, King, they kind of grabbed him by the neck and they said, we're going. And so I don't, you kind of have to take it into an apolitical realm. Forget lobbying, forget elected officials. It is a really harsh lesson, but you saw it in the sit-ins in 1960, and you saw it again in 65.
I don't think there's any doubt that Moynihan had his finger on a major issue. I think the question comes, how did he frame that issue? Why did he frame it in a way that made it so easily captured by conservatives? Very early on, William F. Buckley, people in 65, Wall Street Journal. Moynihan never, he always blamed the left for attacking him, which he was attacked from the left. But equally, if you see the report as a liberal document, the conservatives did as much damage, and he never said, Buckley, that's not what I'm saying. You're wrong. He said, this is great. Buckley supports me. So I think that Moynihan, in some ways, raised some important issues, but I don't think he went all the way to backing the solution. So the sort of the critics of Moynihan that I would think were most right on were not the ones who said, you're wrong. You don't have. There's not a problem. There's not a problem with African American families. Mm-hmm. Obviously, slavery and racism can only damage communities. That's what you would expect. I mean, there's strength there as well, which Moynihan missed, and a lot of his critics rightly pointed out. But the issue is he didn't really unambiguously identify the solutions. That's something that Bayard Rustin said of Moynihan. He said Moynihan is ambivalent about the basic reforms that are needed. Rustin proposed a $100 billion freedom budget that would have provided massive investment in cities in fighting poverty, not just among African Americans, but among all Americans. Moynihan wouldn't endorse that kind of thing. The Johnson administration wouldn't endorse that kind of thing. Robert Kennedy, who later rose from running for president in 68, was asked about Moynihan. He said, Moynihan, he knows all the problems and is against all the solutions.
So let me ask a question then. As you allude to in the text, Moynihan is actually building off a body of scholarship which was overwhelmingly black.
Yep.
And in fact, when we look at the discussion, there are two things going on. Let's take the Buckley-Moynihan deal. They're two New York Irishmen. And the political environment in 1965 is completely different than it is today. Think of this. John Kenneth Galbraith was one of Bill Buckley's best friends. They were skiing partners. John Kenneth Galbraith and Bill Buckley would go to Switzerland and just hang out because the ideological environment was not as toxic and just unbridgeable as it is today. I mean, you got Donald Trump. That stuff is crazy, right? It's just crazy. Buckley, Galbraith, and then the other folk who, so what happens with Moynihan, when Bayard Rustin makes a proposal, Moynihan's response as a liberal is, listen, that's a nice number, that's good rhetoric, but it's not real. That was the argument. I'm not against it, I'm just simply saying it's not going to happen, number one. Number two, what's also fascinating that few people got into, and is that the first major empirical sociological study in the United States on the inner city, somebody take a guess, take a shot. W.E.B. Du Bois, the Philadelphia Negro. Now, what's fascinating, 1896, right? And in the study, his final chapter is sort of what is to be done. And what's fascinating is what Du Bois says, living in the black community, conducting his ethnographic research in that part of Philadelphia. He says, listen, there's some values issues here. There's discrimination. There's racism. He gives all the left stuff. Then he says, not using the same language, there's agency. There's agency. There's all the, and in fact, so this is 1890s. So there's no question that anybody black is going to deny pogroms in the South, lynching, just unbelievable stuff. So Du Bois, so Moynihan is an interesting way, and what was significant with the critics, when we review the critics that you've brilliantly outlined in your footnotes, there is no analysis of the fact that Fraser, Caton, and Drake, all the major black scholars, back to Du Bois in the 1890s, are pushing the issue of agency. You see, and then as you also point out in the text, the other folks, see, there were the right-wingers and left-wingers. That's white people. So there's the paleo-liberals, the conservatives, but then there was another section that you allude to your credit, in the black community, the nationalists, right? And they didn't fit any easy ideological label. So you correctly and courageously say, yeah, there was a left and the right, and that they sort of do what they do. But then there is a more complicated, more nuanced discussion, which has to do with black people who live in the black community, who say that men should not be going around indiscriminately fathering children that they don't take care of. Now, that's not, I don't think, a notoriously, bad proposition. That if you, somehow, we live in a very different ideological world, but the modest proposition that a guy impregnates a woman, is at least a partner. I don't even want to say father, you can't even say that anymore, right? He partners in the production of a child, and he should be held responsible, right? Well, it seems to me that while Moynihan may have been ideologically obnoxious, the bad guy, there were some legitimate issues, and the nationalists raise those issues. And I'll tell you another interesting person on the left that you don't cite to my, as I went over your footnotes carefully. I was very impressed, right? This is very sharp. My man's doing his homework. One of the most interesting books that has a fascinating discussion of Moynihan that nobody cites today is Christopher Lasch, Haven in the Heartless World. There's a fascinating post-partisan left analysis where he says that Moynihan got it wrong. So he agrees with it. Moynihan got it wrong, but for different reasons than what the left says. He says Moynihan did not understand that ultimately, if the black community are just pathetic victims, they have agency. And if they have agency as a good liberal, I'm sure you will agree, right? They must have the capacity collectively to correct this problem. So it's not a question of the left or the right, and maybe ultimately at the end of the day, the black community is going to have to lead in correcting and addressing, which implies for men and women agency. And one of the things that's implied, when you take all the rhetoric from the black national stuff, if you peel all the goofy rhetoric down, ultimately it's a question of communal reorganization and agency. And so, which is what I think you were referring to when you say if you're waiting for the politicians to do this. Because in 65 and Munger, it's agency. I have here, because I make it a point to follow religiously all of my good left literature. I'll make this quick. My wife's, the 1960 edition of Dissent. And I'm actually going to lend this to you, right? And there is a fascinating discussion by Michael Walzer on the state of the movement in 1960. And one of the points that he makes, which Moynihan didn't correctly understand, is that the Moynihan Report ultimately is about agency. But I see my wife saying, "Shut it down, preacher." So I'll pause on that note. We got that on TV, right? and let's mix it up, and then we do some Q&A. Oh yes, 5 minutes. Correct my heresy.
No, let me just pick up on one aspect of it, which is the use of Moynihan by the Nation of Islam, because it is a more complicated story than is typically thought. People think, Moynihan was attacked by all African Americans, but actually, what happens with the Nation of Islam is very interesting. They say, our leader Elijah Muhammad's been saying this for decades. He's been pointing to family problems.
Back to Du Bois.
Yeah. And so they praise Moynihan. Louis Farrakhan
Right,
goes.
right.
He does a five-part newspaper interview with
Louis Farrakhan, y'all.
with Moynihan. But now the issue that the Nation of Islam had with Moynihan was not the message, but I suppose partly the messenger and partly some Moynihan solutions, like Moynihan wanted to draft more African American men in the army or let them enlist, give them jobs. This is during the middle of the Vietnam War, so the Nation of Islam would not go along with that.
No.
But also, I think that there's a question of, and I'm an intellectual historian, so I study the history of ideas. And one of the things this project has made me realize is it's not just the idea that you have, it's the context in which the idea is expressed.
Absolutely.
You know, so it's one thing for, although we can talk about the patriarchal elements of the Moynihan Report and the Nation of Islam, something they shared as well.
Yep.
But it's something very different for Elijah Muhammad to say that message than it is for Moynihan, who is in the national government. And the question really that the Moynihan Report is posing is, you know, what can we do to bring about racial equality? And the problem with the Moynihan Report is when that's the question, you know, and you get this, you know, you'll see this today. I mean, the conservatives use the Moynihan Report in this way. You know, if someone says, you know, well, we got this, I agree with, you know, the need for sort of communal self-mobilization, that's important too, but there is a question of resources and the distribution of resources in our societies, you know, questions of political economy. These affect all Americans. We've got serious problems of class inequality in the society. Often we talk about that in terms of race, but that's part of it, but not all of it. But so when someone says, well, what can we do about racial inequality? And the answer is, you know, the black family. In that context,
Who's the we, though? See, in other words,
Yeah.
I agree. See, the question becomes then, you use the we. Now, for the vast majority of people that live in the worst neighborhoods in you know, New York, Chicago, Jersey City, the we is not this room. The we are the folk that are stuck in those hyper-segregated death camps. And so the question becomes, for those that are sentenced to live economically in these hyper-segregated death camps, the we is the black community. That's the we. Obama, God bless him, is now in the middle of his presidential library. I'll be good, right? And so, who's the we? So that's my issue. When we talk about the we need to really be very, very clear about that because it's misleading, sir.
Well, no, and the you know the black community, Gene, you know there's a different kind of family historically. There's the extended family and there's the community family. Whenever people talk about the Moynihan Report, I'm just amazed by the degree of piety that white America has for the nuclear family. You know, for the kids and the minivan and the golden retriever, and it's astounding. When slavery, the first thing you do is separate the family. You know, and the idea that there isn't going to be a residue of that, or that there isn't going to be a tradition that they grew up to counteract that, and that you are going to, so many people I interviewed in this book were raised by community parents, you know. And so, again, one of the things that I love about Dan's book is the way that the Moynihan Report is used in this sort of diagnostic way. This is what, you know, the debate shows us about this, and, you know, the blinders that we have, that there is just this one way, and that we have to make them like us, and then, I mean, it's the same old story in a lot of ways.
It's a bit more complicated than that, for this reason. See, if you ask the average black person during slavery, or when W.E.B. Du Bois writes The Philadelphia Negro, the idea that parents should, that fathers should not abandon their children, that's not a white idea. No, in other words, for a person who parents a child to take the moral responsibility, right, male or female, so I'm going to get caught in that, right, male or female, right, okay, yeah, well, even that's problematic, but you know what I mean, right, I'm going to get, right, whoever parents the child, right, that's not a white idea, you understand? So when my black mother raises her son by herself because the father abandoned me, so I get drafted in the street gangs when I'm 13. It's not a white idea that I want my father to keep me from getting dragged into a gang. That's security, that's emotional security, it's economics. We talk about inequality, right? Two incomes are better than one. So we don't have to even get into the funny gender and all that craziness, right? We can talk about two economic actors who contribute to the political economy of a particular household, extended or nuclear. And so for black people, it was never imitating white people. It was about survival. Two was better than one. So for us, it wasn't about Moynihan. Look, Moynihan was not our problem. Moynihan was not our problem. Before Moynihan, we was getting toe up from the flow up, right? After Moynihan, who essentially was the messenger, because all he said is what the black scholars had said since W.B. Du Bois. Now, his crime was being a white boy who said it, and then making it a federal memo, and then he got tore up by everybody. And what happened with Johnson, just quickly, when you read any of the Johnson biographies, right? He had favor for about 4 weeks. Once the thing dropped and the press got a hold of it, Johnson said, "Dan who?" And he was thrown under the bus for the next 30 years. Yeah. Concluding statement from the authors, and then questions.
Oh, no, I'm just thanks again for coming.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to open it up for some discussion from the audience.
Sir?
So does progress depend upon the emergence of a kind of a communal black power movement? Is that the next thing that needs to happen?
I'm gonna let y'all take that first.
Communal black power.
I'm not sure what that means, but
Yeah.
Well, no, because I think the progress would have to depend on probably a more diverse bloc, I would imagine. I mean, I don't know if you could have something like, the Panthers today. It's a good question.
For me, I think it's about distribution of resources in the society. I mean, I think the communal action is significant. Community is important, but communities are able to organize better when they have the resources to do so. I mean, these are not, these are not separate ideas. In fact, they go hand in hand, I would say.
Let me sort of tee off your observation. If we look at the history in the 20th century, as both of your books so admirably sort of outline, when they begin in Montgomery, which was not the beginning, by the way, right?
Yeah.
When the blacks start organizing in Birmingham and Selma and Montgomery, there are not a lot of resources. So if economic resources, right, in a social democratic regime is the precondition for development, then blacks are screwed. They're just going to sit there and just drown in their own blood, right? Because the story that you both know is that people with relatively modest resources pooled the cars, right? Fed people. There was this whole communal venture. Eventually, resources came, but it was only after an active agency says, we're not going to take this no more. I mean, when you think about it, right, the resources came after the fact. There were no whole bunch of resources when they organized the bus boycott and carpooled. There were no white folk, there was no Ford Foundation in the beginning. And so the question is, sir, let's reframe it. If the black underclass is simply going to be left to die, and I see no evidence to the contrary anywhere, notwithstanding 2 terms of a black president, right? If they're stuck, if black people have to wait on that social democratic regime to come out of the sky, that my left comrades, who I love deeply, assure me is coming eventually.
Well, people are going to have to organize if they, a redistribution of resources won't happen without a social movement. So,
Let me push you, Bob. Let me push you, make this conversation interesting. Come back to questions. Right now, you know what the truth is? Black people are no longer in. Real talk. I mean, maybe in Harvard Square we're in, but that don't count, right? Black people are not in. We are not the flavor of the month. If you look at look, put it this way, follow the money. The bulk of the money that's being put in social movements have nothing to do with black people, right? There are other disadvantaged groups who have their own identity politics, right? And who analogize the black experience. And they just had a recent Supreme Court victory, all of which is applauded by those who share that view. Black people are no longer in. See, that's the other thing. At least 60 years ago, there was a certain cachet, associated with innocent, cherubic black children who were law-abiding. You leftists call it the politics of respectability, right? Black people call it survival, right? So, and we had some cachet. Part of what Moynihan is suggesting is, hey, y'all, when y'all start talking about black power and revolution, that's not going to play good in Peoria. I'm not sure. Right? And it's true. And the country paid for 40 years with the backlash. In fact, there's a new book out called The New Black Silent Majority. Have y'all heard about that? It's an amazing book on, but we'll go there. Any other questions? I'm sorry.
Let's accept the point that Moynihan was contextually imperfect, but the core of his arguments, his diagnosis is spread. The crisis of the black family is now the crisis of the white family. It's the crisis of families in general.
That's right.
What are the larger implications there? Now listen, I admit that the impact is greatest in African American communities. But what's the larger implication that this is spread, to white, what was once working class America?
John?
well, I mean, it's I can't remember the figures exactly, but the figure that Moynihan cited on out of wedlock births and single parent families for African Americans, it's higher now among white Americans than it was for African Americans
Yes.
then. And Moynihan thought it was a crisis then. I think it's very dangerous to take these statistics and assume what that means about family life. I think you need to go into these communities. You need to study them ethnographically. I don't think you can, obviously, social norms have changed in certain ways. So I'm a historian. I'm not a sociologist, but I don't think you can just take those statistics and assume, draw a simple beliefs about what families are actually like from that.
I have a sociologist, and I'll come to yes.
So that was actually what my question was related to, because William
Okay.
Julius Wilson, famous sociologist, offers a slightly different take. I haven't read your book, so I can't say that your take, but then what I heard you say earlier. He points out that Moynihan distinguishes between middle-class black families and poor black families. So one of the things that seems to have been lost in some of the discussion of Moynihan, again, I'm not taking fault with your book because I haven't read it yet, is that in fact he pinpoints from then that poverty is a problem. And that he did have a solution that he was promoting, which was not primarily about black men enlisting in the military, but rather about mounting a major federal works program.
Right.
Because he saw the problem as being black men not being in a position, a point supported by Elliot Lebo's research in Tally's Corner, ethnographic research in Tally's Corner, black men were not in a position to take care of their families. And so now we have 70% of all black children being born out of wedlock. And according to the work of Sarah McClanahan, which has been, her work is done I think in 1991, and has stood the test of time. Everybody's still referring to it. No one has come up with anything to show to the contrary. Children suffer when they're raised in single-parent households. They suffer academically, they suffer behaviorally, they suffer in terms of their future employment, they suffer in terms of rates of imprisonment, they suffer in terms of out-of-wedlock births themselves, being teenage mothers. So there were undeniable negative consequences, and it's true that it certainly has spread into among poor white families and poor Hispanic families, as the work of Catholic Eden shows. But I think the question that is very troubling to me is that back then, the argument was made on the left that there are all of these different forms in the black family, of family in the black community, only they don't seem to have stood the tide, the consequence of inequality. It doesn't seem to have served kids well that they had these extended families. They still, and I mean, even when you control for socioeconomic status, they're still underachieving relative to their peers. This is still a detriment for them not to be in a two-parent family. With the increasing, the cultural shift you talked about, which validates these new forms of family, I wonder about what's happening to the children. Because sociologists also point to the fact that you have this widening gap. You have a group, pretty much working class, poor people who are not getting married, having children, their kids are underachieving, they're less likely to get married, have children, and they're more likely to have children out of wedlock. So if you have a downward spiral, meanwhile at the upper end, you have an upward spiral, right? Where they're more likely to get married, their kids actually achieve better, are themselves more likely to get married, and you have this upward spiral. So that you have this increasing inequality that's rooted in family form. And instead, what's happening is the very people, sorry.
Good, finish it, wrap it
The
up.
very people
Wrap it
who
up.
got this moving, upper class white liberals who said that family doesn't matter and you should go out there and have a sexual revolution, they're the ones getting married.
The
They're
boomers.
the ones benefiting from the thing that they trashed. And the people who are being victimized by it are the poor. Black, white, Hispanic.
Sir.
Right out of Charles Murray coming apart on
Yeah.
white America,
Yeah,
which is now 30%. He describes
Yeah.
exactly the way Moynihan described the African American community
Yeah.
back then, which leads me to conclude that 20-year period of Keynesian economics created, along with segregation, created a white bubble, and the air of which has slowly been letting out for the last 30 years. So what we're really doing is integrating the underclass. That's our great achievement.
yeah. They all live in hell together. Yes, ma'am.
So for Mr. Geary, I was intrigued by your statement that if the civil rights movement is a continuum and ed reform is on that arc, I'm just curious what you think sort of a comparable ed reform movement and/or document comparable to the Moynihan Report where action is reacting to something related to the state of education today.
I don't know about a comparable document. The education reform that I witnessed and profiled is, community organizing, which tends to be unglamorous and is very difficult for the public to take hold of. But it's connecting strata of a community. It's having mass meetings. It's bringing teachers in with the churches and with the school board and with the parents, and you put them all in a room and you get them on the same page, which is how the vote was won at the grassroots level. You make this push down at the bottom. I mean, when you're talking about dilemma actions and education, it can be tough because you see it gets pushed back on the teachers in a lot of cases, right? Those teachers walk out in Chicago and it's their fault. So sometimes when you go out in the street and demonstrate in this particular window, you won't have the mass public on your side. It's not a given that you will. Yeah.
Sir.
Eugene used that word agency several times. You elaborate. It almost seems like you're suggesting going back 1800. Poor blacks are going to figure this out on their own and can't see the solution.
Oh, sure. By agency, I mean capacity, the ability to be self-determining. Agency here means that I have the capacity as a human being equal to others to act on my behalf. That I am simply not some biological basket case who simply has to be corrected by others because I'm genetically defective. I actually have abilities, I have imagination, I have intelligence, and as my history, as the history of humanity, forget black people, as the history of humanity demonstrates, right? People in adverse circumstances with with opportunity and the confluence of forces in their favor can act in their behalf. And what we know from the history, the concern about the black family has been a concern of black people. If we take one of the most important sociologists of the entire 20th century, W.B. Du Bois, the issue of the black family from his first major empirical study was a major priority. And the thing that sort of confused Moynihan was, wait a minute, I'm not saying anything really terribly different than what Du Bois said, or E. Franklin Frazier, or the other black scholars. And so, in 2015, the issue for the black community, given the stuff that's going on, just unbelievable suffering and violence, is that the black community has to organize in new ways. And rhetoric's no substitute for the nitty-gritty kind of organizing that Jim Foreman, Bob Moses, Diane Nash, Ella Baker, and those folk did. There's just no substitute for that. Because the cavalry's not coming to save poor black people. It's not going to happen. We're going to have to organize in some completely new ways and develop strategic alliances with people of goodwill. And so the issue isn't, see, black people have always worked with other groups, even as nationalists. We understood that there need to be alliances. You go back to Civil War, my favorite Americans, right? John Brown, that's my man, right? John Brown, Abraham Lincoln, and George Tecumseh Sherman. God bless him for marching to the Atlantic Ocean. Praise the Lord. Yes, ma'am.
I'm relatively new to thinking about organizing, so forgive me if my question sounds a little bit naive, but I have two questions. One is thinking about, like, what is so there's been a little bit of talk about the next thing is to organize and to, like, call for action. And I'm wondering if you have a sense of what the specific what the specific demands are at this moment, what would make the next big shift. And then my other question is, what does organizing look like now? How has it been shifted at this particular moment in time? How is it impacted by the way that we're interacting globally or digitally?
Well, to take the second part of the question, and I wish I had a better answer for you, but it's social media. It's Twitter. You saw that in Africa when they tried to ban it, and so that's a huge part of it. And that's what prevents me from saying what I kind of want to say, which is that organizing always looks the same. It doesn't really matter what time period. It's a bunch of people in a room talking and strategizing and, debating and coming up with a consensus or what have you. Whether or not, as you started out, there's a unified set of demands, I have no idea what that means. Maybe there are too many demands. Something that in the 60s, it seems when you look back that everybody was pushing on one door, whether it was Jim Crow or whether it was the vote. Now there's about 9,000 doors. Activists talk about, being siloed. People are in the education silo, people are in the voting rights silo. And so, to make coalitions to kind of bridge that fragmentation, that itself has to be one of the tenets of organizing now.
Yes, ma'am.
Or maybe one or two short questions.
One, two.
I wonder what each of the three of you think about the idea of decriminalizing drugs, even hard drugs. I know that would reduce incarceration. I don't know what other effects it would have on the community. I wonder if you've thought about that.
I think this is one of the points that Ta-Nehisi Coates makes in his article, which he talks about the Moynihan Report, where he says, I guess the thing you could say about often the debate on the Moynihan Report is framed in terms of can government do something, can it not? But maybe we should first say, well, what can we stop government from doing that's exacerbating the problem? And clearly, I think it makes a persuasive case that mass incarceration has had devastating consequences, and there's many ways of tackling it. I think one of the answers has to be decriminalizing drugs. There's no need to be putting minor drug offenders in prison, and I don't, so it's something I would certainly favor.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know about hard drug, who knows, but it's not just the one thing. There needs to be a whole raft of measures to undo since the 70s.
On the question of decriminalization, I think what would have to precede that, which the left has avoided for 50 years, is the issue of violent crime. See, the great failure of the left for the last 50 years, right, is that the left had no theory of criminality. If you go back and you think of the rhetoric that we were trading in, see, I'm 150 years old, so I remember this stuff, right? When the Black Panther Party says they want to launch a war against the United States and decapitate Nixon, that's Eldridge Cleaver's specialty, right? That rhetoric produced a backlash that the left, since they were all kids, could not have imagined. And then it shifted from there to guerrilla war in the prisons. And so there's a whole history that the left has never come to terms with, within which, as a context, where we have to situate what do we decriminalize now? Because to date, we don't have a grand theory, political theory, of how to deal, A, with the history of the political violence of the left, and the black left in particular, and how it's gone out. So, sir, last question.
I walked in off the street, so I caught this discussion midstream.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering, am I correct in remembering that you have supported Republican presidential candidates? That's my pretty clear recollection.
Okay, no, I'll tell you what I've supported. I've supported black people because my view is today, black people have no permanent friends or enemies, just permanent interests.
Well, have you supported Republicans?
Well, supported, I've worked with them, no. Support, no. Work with, yes.
You have not supported, you have not endorsed any Republicans running for president?
I don't think you got something I don't know.
Okay, all right.
If you know something I don't know, I work with them. No, I want to be clear about this, since you raised the question, right? I worked with, when Al Gore was running for president, right? I worked with Gore, met with Bush, right? In both cases, my view has always been bipartisan. In fact, was it 2005? Hillary Clinton hosted a major event for us. I worked with Hillary Clinton. I worked with the Clintons. I worked with the Bush. I work with anybody. I don't think I can do John Trump. Trump's a bit much. I mean, that's, even for me, that's sort of over the top. So we good?
Thank you so much.
I say that 50 years ago today didn't just come out of whole cloth. It was the fulfillment and manifestation of years and years of advocacy in the face of injustice.